The night Caleb Reyes found her, the temperature had dropped hard enough that frost was already forming on the fence posts, and he had only gone out to check on a fussing mare when the lantern light caught something that should not have been there. A shape huddled against the base of the old oak near the property line, wrapped in a shawl too thin for the cold, still as death itself. For one terrible moment, his heart seized with the thought that he was looking at a corpse, and the memory of another still body, his wife Rebecca's, laid out in this same unforgiving Montana winter 3 years past, rose up in him so fast and so sharp that he nearly dropped the lantern. But then the shape stirred, a small, involuntary shiver, and Caleb was moving before he'd fully decided to move, boots crunching across frozen ground, calling out into the dark. "Mom! Ma'am, can you hear me?" The woman who lifted her head to look at him had a face that might have been beautiful under different circumstances, and was, he would come to think later, beautiful even under these. But in that moment it was mostly a face carved from exhaustion and cold, lips nearly blue, dark eyes glassy with a fatigue that went past mere sleeplessness into something closer to defeat. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice cracked on the words, thin as the shawl that covered her. "I'll move on. I didn't mean to trespass." "You'll freeze to death before you move 10 feet, Caleb said, more roughly than he intended, already shrugging out of his own coat and settling it over her shoulders. "What in God's name are you doing out here alone at night?" She did not answer right away, and when she finally did, the words came out with a particular flatness of someone reciting a fact so painful it had to be delivered without feeling or else not delivered at all. "My family put me out. There was nowhere else to go." Caleb had lived in this territory his whole life, had seen hard winters take good men and good families alike, but something about the plain, unadorned horror of those words, a family casting a woman out into a Montana night in the dead of winter, settled into him like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through every protective instinct he had left after 3 years of grief had supposedly numbed most of them. "You're coming inside," he said, and it was not a question, and something in his tone left no room for the kind of polite refusal she looked, for a moment, like she might attempt. "My daughter's asleep, but there's a fire and a bed that isn't being used, and you're not spending another minute out here." Her name, he learned once he'd gotten her inside and settled by the hearth with a blanket and hot broth pressed into shaking hands, was Delphine Cross, and the story that emerged from her, haltingly, over that first night and the days that followed, was one that made Caleb's jaw tighten every time he thought of it. She had been married once, briefly, to a man in Helena who had turned out to have debts and a temper in equal terrible measure, and when he died in a barroom brawl gone wrong, his family had blamed her for his troubles, claiming she'd driven him to drink and ruin with her demands, though from what Caleb could piece together, the truth was closer to the opposite. Her own family, ashamed of the scandal and unwilling to shoulder the burden of a widowed daughter with a ruined reputation, had first tolerated her return to their household with cold silence. Then, when a new stepfather entered the picture with no patience for another mouth to feed, had put her out entirely, giving her 3 days to find somewhere else to be before her belongings would be left on the road for anyone to take. "I thought I might find work in the next town," Delphine said, staring into the fire rather than at him, the particular shame of a woman and used to charity making her voice small. "I didn't account for the distance, or the cold. I should have planned better." "You shouldn't have had to plan for surviving a night like tonight at all," Caleb said. "That's not a failure of planning. That's a failure of everyone who was supposed to look after you and didn't." She looked at him then, something startled in her expression, as if she had expected judgment, and instead found only a quiet, steady anger directed entirely at the people who had failed her rather than at her for needing help. His daughter, Josephine, 6 years old and sharp-eyed in the way of children who have already learned that the world can take important people away without warning, regarded Delphine the next morning with a particular suspicion of a child protecting the fragile piece of a household rebuilt after loss. "Is she going to stay?" Josephine asked her father directly, in the blunt way children have of asking the questions adults dance around. "For now," Caleb said. "She needs help, Joe. The way we needed help after your mama passed, remember? Mrs. Abernathy bringing us stew for a month because your papa forgot how to cook anything but burnt eggs." Josephine considered this with the gravity of a much older person weighing evidence. Mrs. Abernathy didn't sleep in Mama's old room, though. No, Caleb agreed, feeling the weight of that observation more than he wanted to admit. She didn't. But necessity, as it often does, wore down resistance faster than sentiment could reinforce it, and within a week, Delphine had made herself useful in ways that even a wary 6-year-old could not entirely dismiss, mending Josephine's torn dresses with a skill that spoke of a woman who had learned, out of necessity, to make do with little, taking over the cooking with a deft hand that produced meals considerably better than Caleb's own burnt egg repertoire. And, most surprisingly to Caleb, engaging Josephine in the kind of patient, attentive conversation that the child, starved for a mother's steady presence, seemed to drink in like parched ground receiving rain. Caleb watched this unfold with a complicated tangle of feelings he did not immediately examine too closely. There was relief, certainly, at seeing his daughter laugh again in a way she hadn't laughed since Rebecca's death. There was gratitude for the practical help, undeniable in a household that had been limping along on his exhausted improvisation for 3 years. But there was something else too, something that first announced itself as simple appreciation for Delphine's quiet competence and slowly, over weeks that turned into a month and then 2, revealed itself to be something considerably less simple. He found himself noticing the particular way she hummed while kneading bread dough, an old tune he didn't recognize but found himself humming along to without meaning to. He found himself lingering at the supper table after Josephine had gone to bed, talking with Delphine about matters that had nothing to do with the practical business of running a household. Her thoughts on the books she'd started borrowing from his modest shelf, her memories of a childhood in Ohio before her family's fortunes had soured, her careful, tentative opinions on the wider world beyond the ranch that she offered as if testing whether they would be welcomed or dismissed. "You don't have to be so careful with me," Caleb told her one evening in February, when she'd apologized again, for voicing a disagreement about the best way to store the winter's remaining potatoes. "I like when you say what you actually think. God knows I get tired of the sound of my own opinions." "I'm not used to it being welcomed," Delphine admitted. "My husband didn't care for opinions that differed from his own. Neither did my family in the end. It's easier to stay quiet than to be punished for speaking." "You won't be punished here," Caleb said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised him. "Not for anything you actually are, Delphine. I don't want the careful version. I want to know what you really think." Something shifted between them after that conversation, subtle but unmistakable, the way ice shifts before a thaw becomes visible. Small kindnesses that lingered a beat longer than necessary, glances exchanged across the supper table that neither quite looked away from as quickly as propriety might have suggested, a growing ease in each other's company that both of them, cautious survivors of their respective griefs, were careful not to name aloud. It was Josephine, in the end, who forced the matter into the open, with a particular bluntness of a child who has decided something is true and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. "You love her," she announced to her father one morning in March, apropos of nothing, while Delphine was out hanging laundry and could not overhear. "The way you used to look at Mama in the picture. That's how you look at her now." Caleb, caught entirely off guard, found himself without a ready denial, in part because the accusation was true and in part because some deep, tired part of him no longer wanted to deny it. "Would that trouble you?" he asked carefully. "If I did?" Josephine considered this with the same gravity she'd applied to the question of Delphine sleeping in her mother's old room, weeks before. "Mama would want you to be happy," she said finally. "And I like when Delphine reads to me. And she makes the bread taste better than yours." A pause. "I think it would be all right. If you loved her." That evening, after Josephine had gone to sleep, Caleb found Delphine on the porch, wrapped against the lingering cold, looking out at the same stretch of frozen ground where he'd found her 3 months before, and something in her posture told him she was thinking of that night too, of everything that had led her there and everything that had happened since. "I keep thinking," she said without turning to look at him, "that I should be grateful and nothing more. That wanting more than shelter and kindness from you would be greedy, after everything you've already given me. And if I told you," Caleb said, coming to stand beside her, "that I want to give you more, not because you're owed it, but because I've come to care for you in a way I didn't expect to care for anyone again? Would that still feel like greed? Delphine turned to look at him then, and in the moonlight, Caleb could see the particular vulnerability of a woman who had been told, by every important person in her life, that she was a burden rather than a blessing, daring to hope that one person, finally, might see her differently. "My family cast me out," she said quietly, "because they decided I was more trouble than I was worth. I have spent every day since wondering if that judgment was true, if perhaps I simply am the kind of person circumstances abandon." "Your family," Caleb said, with the same quiet anger he'd felt that first night, "made a choice about their own comfort and called it a judgment about your worth. Those aren't the same thing, Delphine. I found a woman freezing to death because the people meant to protect her chose convenience over decency. That's not a story about what you're worth. It's a story about what they failed to be." "Then what does this story become?" she asked, and there was something like genuine hope in the question now, fragile but present. "The one we're writing, you and Josephine and me?" "I think," Caleb said, reaching for her hand and finding it, despite the cold night air, warmer than he expected. "It becomes a story about a woman who was cast out by people who didn't deserve to keep her, and found her way, instead, to people who intend to spend the rest of their lives grateful that she did." He kissed her then, on the porch where he'd once carried her in from the cold, and Delphine, for the first time in longer than she could remember, let herself believe, fully and without reservation, that she had finally found a place where she was wanted rather than merely tolerated. They married in the spring, a small ceremony with only a handful of neighbors and Josephine standing proudly at her new mother's side, having appointed herself, with considerable seriousness, as the one responsible for holding the rings. Delphine's family was not invited, and did not ask to attend, and if any part of her still ached at that absence, she found that the ache had grown smaller, day by day, surrounded by two people who had chosen her not out of family obligation but out of genuine, deliberate love. Years later, when Josephine, grown into a young woman herself, asked her stepmother how she and her father had truly fallen in love, Delphine would tell her about the frost on the fence posts, and the lantern light in the darkness, and the coat placed over her shoulders by a stranger who had refused to let her freeze. Not merely from the cold that night, but from the colder, crueler freeze of believing herself unworthy of rescue. "Your father didn't just save me from the weather," she would say. "He saved me from believing what my family wanted me to believe about myself. That's a rescue that matters a great deal more than warmth, in the end." And every winter after, when the first hard frost settled onto the Montana ranch that had become, against every reasonable expectation, the truest home Delphine had ever known, she would think of that night beneath the old oak tree, and marvel at how completely a single act of unearned kindness had rewritten the entire remaining story of her life. If this story of resilience, unexpected kindness, and a love that rescued more than just a body from the cold touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more tales of the frontier, where every act of grace can change a life forever.